Okay. Okay, so let's start with the chapter, Respiratory System, chapter 23. And we start off with functions. What are the functions of the respiratory system? Well, there they all are right there. Obviously, gas exchange. We'll talk a lot about that in the lungs. Vocalizations. I'm using my respiratory system right now to talk to you. I'm blowing air over my vocal cords. And this is respiration. pH regulation. It's really, you should think of the level of oxygen in your blood as really important. And it is. But in regulating your, we're going to find out that in regulating how often you breathe, it's oxygen has really nothing to do with it, except in special circumstances. It's CO2. The concentration of CO2 in your blood is really important because it's directly linked to the pH of your blood. Homeostasis for pH regulation. So I'll show you later on in this chapter the equation that relates CO2 concentration in your blood to pH. Venous return. I mean, how much blood comes back to your heart from your lungs? That's due to the size of the pulmonary vessels coming back, the pulmonary veins coming back to your heart. Blood pressure regulation. You may not have remembered this, but in the cardiovascular, the blood vessel chapter, when we talked about blood pressure regulation, talked about the renin-angiotensin mechanism, and that when the blood pressure falls, renin is secreted by your kidneys, and it converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Then when angiotensin 1 goes to the lungs, there's a second enzyme called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. And it converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, which raises blood pressure by making you thirsty, by constricting blood vessels all over your body, and by stimulating your adrenal medulla to secrete aldosterone. Also, I just learned this like today, that the membrane protein that angiotensin attaches to the receptor called the ACE receptor is also the receptor that the coronavirus uses to enter lung cells. Kind of coincidence. Okay, then the Valsalva maneuver. This is when we get to the anatomy of the respiratory system, learn that the opening to your trachea, it's called the glottis, and there's a way that we can close our glottis. You can voluntarily close your glottis like this. It's closed. And if you close your glottis and contract your abdominal muscles, this is called the Valsalva maneuver. And what it's used for is elimination, urination and defecation. We will use the Valsalva maneuver for that. Okay, look at the anatomy of the respiratory system. We have what's called the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. We put that up too. Oh, the conducting zone. This just conducts air into your lungs. So like the cardiovascular system, they're tubes. In this case, they're carrying air. And they're pretty sophisticated tubes. And they're tubes that have muscle on them, and you can change the size of these tubes. And then when you get the air into your lungs, the functional area where gas exchange occurs is little blind-ended sacs deep within your lung called the alveoli. So we have to get air to the alveoli. And we do it using the conducting zone. So there's a gas exchange going on here. It's like the cardiovascular system. There's no exchange in arteries and veins. It only happens in the capillaries. Okay, so obviously your nose. You breathe through your nose. You can also breathe through your mouth, but it's better actually to breathe through your nose because the air, when you breathe through your nose, the air goes through these convoluted pathways called the nasal conchae. And what they do is they warm up the air before it reaches your lungs, and it humidifies the air before it reaches your lungs. Breathe through your mouth, and that doesn't happen. The pharynx. It's this big, I'm going to be tripping over this thing the whole time. Anyway, the pharynx is this big space in the back of your throat, in the back of your nasal passages, and behind or dorsal to the opening to your trachea called the glottis, or that's part of the larynx. And there's three big parts: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx in the back of your mouth, and the laryngopharynx, which is just dorsal or posterior to the larynx. And this is a important area for what I'm doing right now, for vocalizing. This space is an echoing chamber for making sounds. I can make all these different sounds because I've got this resonating chamber called the larynx. I can change its shape and this was important for speech. But there's a danger in it also, because we have two tubes down here. A trachea that carries air, and behind it, we have an esophagus that carries food and water. Okay, doesn't make too much difference. So both things go down toward those openings of those two tubes. Air goes down and out, and food and drink goes down toward those two tubes. Now, and you want to make sure things go to the right tube. Doesn't matter too much whether air gets into your esophagus or not, and some air gets into your stomach. That's not a big deal. But you don't want liquids and food getting into your trachea and blocking it. That would, it's called a cafe coronary, and that stops your breathing, and if you don't clear that, you're gonna die. So that's the danger. So we have a serious danger, and we're gonna learn that there's something called the epiglottis, that when you swallow, it closes the glottis to make sure that what you're swallowing goes into your esophagus and not into your trachea. Okay. It's interesting enough, we're primates, and our really close relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, they can actually understand speech. We know that, and they can do speech, sign language, and we know that because we've seen it. But they can't speak. And one of the reasons why they can't speak is that they don't have this pharynx, this big resonating chamber. And so they never choke, but they can't make the sounds that we do. So it's a special adaptation for human beings. Okay, and then in the larynx, like I said, this is farther down. This is your larynx right here. This is called the laryngeal protuberance or the Adam's apple. This is your larynx. And it surrounds the opening of the trachea. And there's that epiglottis to block that opening when you swallow. And also hard and soft palate. So we have our nasal passages here and in our mouth. And between the mouth and in nasal passages is a palate, divided up into hard palate and soft palate. The hard palate is bone. It's actually called a palatine bone. You got that last semester. So the anterior part is the palatine bone. No, actually, the anterior part is the maxillar bone. The posterior part of the palatine bone. And then posterior to that is the soft palate. And right at the end of the soft palate is that little thing that hangs down in the back of your throat called the uvula. Now, what do you need this palate for? Why do we need a palate? Because cold-blooded organisms, like reptiles, like snakes, and they don't have a palate. Their nasal passages directly lead into their mouth. We need a palate so that we can only interrupt our breathing for brief periods of time. So we want to be able to chew and breathe at the same time. And then when we swallow a food or drink, we just interrupt breathing for a brief moment because we have this internal furnace that has to be stoked with oxygen. And we can't stop breathing for very long. A couple of minutes, 2 to 4 minutes, and more than like 4 minutes, you'll get irreversible brain damage. Get like 4 to 6 minutes irreversible brain damage if you don't breathe. So we only want to interrupt breathing for brief moments. So in order to, but we have to chew our food. So here's how we can chew and breathe at the same time because we have a hard palate. Okay. The trachea, it has to be held open for air to go into it. So it has cartilage rings. Your esophagus is if you're not swallowing it, your esophagus is collapsed because it's just muscle and connective tissue. Cartilage is muscle connective tissue plus cartilage rings to keep it open at all times. And the rings, you can actually feel the rings. If you go below your larynx, you can feel rings, and they go 3/4 of the way around. And then on the dorsal surface, the posterior surface of the trachea, there actually aren't any cartilage rings. And the cartilage rings only go 3/4 of the way, or maybe a little more around. Okay. And then we have bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles. Well, this is called the respiratory tree. You have this trachea, which breaks up into right and left bronchi. And those become smaller and smaller and branching passageways called bronchioles. Then terminal bronchioles, then what's called respiratory bronchioles, then what's called alveolar ducts, and then these blinded sacs called the alveoli. So we're going to see this in a later slide. Okay. Because once we get past the conducting zone, as far as the terminal bronchioles, that's all conducting. When we get to the respiratory zone, we get the respiratory bronchioles, which are still smaller, and there's still no gas exchange there, even though they're in the respiratory zone. But we get into alveolar duct and alveoli, there's true respiration. That's where gas exchange occurs. Okay, the lining of the respiratory tract. It's a mucous membrane. Um, and we're going to look at the mucous membrane a little bit later on, its parts. It has certain layers of the respiratory membrane. The most innermost layer is an epithelium, and a progressively thinner and thinner epithelium when you get closer and closer to the alveoli. When you get to the alveoli, it's going to be one single cell layer thick, a squamous. This is shown on page 902, progressively thinner epithelium as you go from pseudostratified ciliate columnar epithelia in the trachea and bronchi to a simple ciliate columnar epithelium in the smaller bronchi and bronchioles, then a simple ciliate cuboidal epithelium in the terminal respiratory bronchioles, and then a simple squamous epithelium lining the alveoli. And the ciliate epithelium does an important thing. So your whole most of your conducting zone is lined by a ciliate epithelium, either a pseudostratified ciliate epithelium or a columnar ciliate epithelium, or a cuboidal ciliate epithelium. And the cilia are really important because they are constantly moving. And there are, this is a mucous membrane, so there are goblet cells that line your conducting pathways, that put mucus out on the surface of these conducting pathways. And the mucus is sticky. And if you realize that when you breathe in, you just don't breathe in air. You breathe in all kinds of stuff, dust, fungal cells, spores, fungal spores, bacteria that are floating in the air, all kinds of stuff you breathe in. Now, you don't want this stuff to get down into those alveoli. It could cause a respiratory infection, could clog things up, inhibit gas exchange. So what happens is these little particles, dust particles or whatever, are going down there, and most likely they're going to hit the sides of the tube. If they hit the sides of the tube, they're going to get stuck in the mucus. And what these cilia does is the cilia vibrate and move the mucus up from the terminal bronchioles and bronchioles to bronchi, up the trachea, and up to the glottis. The cilia that line your nasal passages, the mucous membrane also, that mucus is moved down by cilia, and it comes out of the trachea and goes right into the laryngeal pharynx. And then you swallow. I mean, even though you're not eating or drinking something, you're swallowing all day long. Every once in a while, you swallow. And when you do that, you swallow mucus. Congratulations, you're swallowing mucus. But it's your mucus, and it's important that you swallow it because it's going to go into your GI tract. You're going to digest your own mucus, recover those amino acids. But all that dust and bacteria and fungal spores and everything you breathe in is going to go into your stomach. And those bacteria, spores, and fungal spores are going to be destroyed by the acid in your stomach, and all the dust is going to go into your small intestine and your large intestine, and part of your feces is going to be stuff you breathe in. It's called a mucociliary escalator. Okay. Oh, and the smooth muscle that surrounds all of these conducting pathways up until the respiratory bronchiole. And then when we get into alveolar ducts, there's no more muscle. So we can change the size of these passageways. It's called bronchodilation when they get larger, bronchoconstriction when they get smaller, by contracting or relaxing the smooth muscle that surrounds these passageways. Okay. Here is a, where is this? Oh, this is on page 901, the page before that. So we have structural organization and functional organization of the respiratory system. Upper respiratory tract, nasal passages, mouth, pharynx, and then the lower respiratory tract, trachea down to the whole bronchial tree. Then the functional organization is the conducting zone, and that includes all of the upper respiratory tract and half of the lower respiratory tract, the whole bronchial tree up until respiratory bronchioles is all the conducting zone. And then when we get down to alveolar ducts and alveoli, here's the real respiratory zone where gas exchange occurs. So gas exchange occurs in the respiratory zone. It doesn't occur in the conducting zone. The conducting zone just conducts air into and out of the lungs. Okay. Here is a blow up here of the final endpoints of the respiratory system, and we have a model in lab that looks very much like this. The branch of the pulmonary artery, we got a bronchiole that goes to a respiratory bronchiole, it goes to an alveolar duct, alveoli, and the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. Capillaries that will coalesce into a pulmonary venule that will be branched into the pulmonary vein and bring oxygenated blood back to the heart. And of course, pulmonary artery is bringing deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the arterial side of those capillaries. All right. And then, okay, and now the alveolar sacs are really the place where most of the gas exchange occurs. And there's millions of them in your lungs. I think the entire surface area, if you spread out all the alveoli in your lungs, it'd be the size of a tennis court. That's how much surface area is squeezed into this thoracic cavity. Okay. Okay, gross anatomy of the lungs. We'll look at lung surfaces, lobes of the lungs, and something called the cardiac impression, or sometimes called the cardiac notch. We'll show you that in the next slide. And then the bronchial tree, remember, is all these conducting pathways, and changing diameter affects how much air gets into the lungs and out. Bronchial constriction is a parasympathetic response. So the parasympathetic nervous system causes bronchial constriction. The sympathetic nervous system causes bronchial dilation. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight system, right? Prepares you for action. Well, if you're going to be really active, you're going to need more air, all right, more oxygen. If you just sitting and relaxing and not moving too much, your sympathetic nervous system takes over. And you don't need that much air, so you'll constrict those conducting pathways with the parasympathetic nervous system. Now this is the gross anatomy, and if you download this from D2L, this slide is not in here, but I just put it in today. And I just went to Google and put in lung figures and pulled it up and slapped it on here. So here are the two gross anatomy of the lungs, and we'll have, this will be a lab thing. The lab next week is going to be respiratory anatomy. We're going to have some lungs, and we're going to have first the surfaces of the lungs. All the ventral aspect of the lungs, the side aspect of the lungs, and the posterior dorsal aspects of the lungs are called the mediastinal, no, it's called the costal surfaces, because costal refers to ribs. So remember, your lungs are protected by ribs, and the part of the lung that is next to a rib is called the costal surface. The inside part of the lung, where the major bronchi go in, are called the mediastinal surface, because this is the mediastinum right here, facing the heart. The heart is in the mediastinum, and so the inside part of the lungs face the heart, and so that's called the mediastinal surface. You notice that the lungs are divided up into lobes, and there's a violation of bilateral symmetry with the lungs. The right lung actually has 3 lobes: superior lobe, middle lobe, inferior lobe. The left lung only has 2 lobes, a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. So that's kind of strange, but that's the way it is. And then this figure says cardiac notch. The book has cardiac impression. Either one is good. It's the fact that there's a little like chunk taken out of the left lung. Not really torn out, but it's modified a little bit, a little indentation on the left lung, because the heart leans to the left. It needs a little bit more room on the left. So there's a little bit of less lung on the left to give room for the heart. And that's called a cardiac notch or cardiac impression, that area. Okay. The alveoli, the real functional area of the lungs, where gas exchange occurs. Gas exchange occurs across what's called the respiratory membrane. And it's composed of some lung cells, sometimes called pneumocytes. The book doesn't call them pneumocytes. There's 2 kinds of pneumocytes. One is type 1, squamous alveolar cell. Another one is called type 2, or septal cells. So the respiratory membrane consists of this squamous epithelial cell called the alveolar cell, type 1. And then there's a simple squamous epithelium that lines capillaries, right, the tunica intima. And they're slapped right next to each other. And there's a little bit of basement membrane between them, glycoproteins and things between. But it's very thin. So because we want the fusion to happen rapidly across this thin membrane, the fusion has to be really rapid. Red blood cells only spend about 0.2 of a second in the capillary, in the alveolar capillaries. So in 0.2 of a second, they have to be saturated with oxygen and get rid of enough CO2. So it has to be really, really rapid. And the thing is that the fusion is really rapid over very tiny distances, but it really slows down rapidly as you make that distance greater and greater and greater. And this is the danger, actually, of pulmonary edema, because we'll learn that there's almost no interstitial fluid in the lungs. These 2 cell layers are slapped right next to each other, and almost no interstitial fluid in the lungs. If you start putting interstitial fluid in the lungs, if you do have pulmonary edema, then that causes the rate of gas exchange to really drop off quickly, and that's really a life-threatening thing, because then you're not getting enough oxygen and you're not getting rid of enough CO2. The type 2 septal cells, type 2 alveolar cells, they produce surfactant. And what surfactant is really a biological detergent. You see, this is a moist membrane. The alveoli are moist. There's water down there, lining the alveoli, a very thin layer of water. The thing is, though, it's such a small little balloon that if that the water surface tension of water would collapse all these alveoli. So what we need is a little bit of detergent to decrease the surface tension of water in the alveoli so they remain open. So they're little tiny, tiny little balloons and they all remain open. And a type 2 are the ones that make the surfactant. All right. This is a real problem in newborn infants because one of the last things to develop in a fetus is the lungs. And one of the last things in the last system to develop is surfactant. So oftentimes premature infants have real trouble breathing because they haven't made the surfactant yet. And they have to get artificial surfactant into these tiny little babies' lungs in order for them to breathe. Then there are alveolar macrophages, or dust cells. As I mentioned, sometimes dust and stuff doesn't get stuck in the mucociliary escalator, but actually gets down to the alveoli. Fortunately, there are macrophages that are wandering around in the alveoli, picking up and chewing up any kind of dust or bacteria spore or fungal spore that actually makes it into the alveoli. Now the pleura. This is a thoracic cavity, and there's two pleural cavities within the thoracic cavity. And there's one lung in each pleural cavity. So we have two of them. And remember, just like every cavity in the body, there's a parietal layer and a visceral layer. So the cavity itself is lined by the parietal pleura, it's called. And the lungs have a simple squamous epithelium called the visceral pleura that covers it. This is another serous membrane. And but the pleural cavity is really a virtual cavity. There is really no cavity there because of what's called interpleural pressure. When we get to pressure, we're going to talk a lot about pressure differences in the lungs and how we're able to suck air into our lungs and push it out by changing the pressure, various pressures inside the lung. So that's called the pleurae, or the simple squamous epithelial linings of the pleural cavities and of the outside surface of the lungs themselves. Here is a depiction of the respiratory membrane. You have these alveoli, you have the type 1 alveolar cell lining the alveoli, they're flat, and then you have these type 2 that are a little more globular, that make surfactant, and then they should show you a alveolar macrophage there, and that thickness on the right is the respiratory membrane. You see how it consists of a type 1 alveolar cell and a endothelial cell lining the capillary with a little bit of basement membrane in between. And see there's almost no fluid space between those two squamous epithelia. And that's where diffusion of O2 and CO2 happens. O2 from the alveolus into the blood, CO2 from the blood into the alveolus. Okay, I'm going to cut it out right there because that's a little more than half an hour. And then, so this is going to be respiratory 1, and I'll pick it up on this slide on the next video, respiratory 2. So, see you later. Catch you in the next video.